Welcome to Seeing Through Ancient Eyes, where I share unexpected insights about Torah, diving deep into the ancient Near East culture to uncover just how much better our God is than any of the other powers that we might ever want to put our hope and our trust in. I'm Gail Heaton, and if this is your first time here, I want to welcome you. And I also want to let you know that each week I'm going to take one little bite-sized piece of ancient Near East culture that's pulled from the Torah portion. And I want to do this so that you can get a better idea of the culture that the Torah was given and lived. Because when you know what the ancients were up against, you'll be able to, I think, better see how God met them right where they were at. And when you can see what he's done for the ancients, based on these cultural insights I'll give you each week, then I think you might just trust him even more in your own life in our modern culture. So that's the idea. Now, this week, we are in Chayei Sarah, which means the life of Sarah. We're going to look at two verses specifically this week. Genesis 23, verses 3 through 4. So let's read those. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, I am a foreigner and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site so I can bury my dead. Okay? Now, if you remember a couple weeks ago, I believe it was in Torah portion Lech Lecha, I introduced to you the idea that there's three things essential for people in the ancient world in terms of crafting their identity. The land that they were tied to, the family that they belonged to, and the gods they served. Okay, so we have the land, the people, and their gods. So I want you to watch for these to show up in the biblical texts and look for how these three aspects of identity continue to unfold in Genesis specifically as we progress through the book. Okay? So Abraham was nomadic, right? Lived in tents, moved from place to place with his sheep and his goats and family. But here in this Torah portion, we see that he buys land where he's going to bury his wife, Sarah. So he's been in the land as a foreigner for a couple of decades now. And he's about to put down his first roots into the land. So what we're beginning to see is like a first tie to the land, okay? This is a move forward into digging roots deep, deep, deep into the land. But there's kind of a snag. At this point, Abraham is a foreigner in this land, right? So I want to take you on an exploration of Abraham's land purchase from an ancient Near East perspective so that you can see how this land connection for his family unfolds. The land, the people, and their God, all right? So, Abraham purchases land to bury Sarah. Now, this photograph here is a photograph. I took it in Hebron in 2019. It's a photograph of the excavated ruins of the very gates in the city of Hebron, where this purchase took place. So the city gates is where this purchase and really all commerce transactions in the city took place. So let's talk about the city gate for a little bit. It was considered like the civic forum and kind of the heart of the city. Now, today when we hear the word gates and we imagine maybe a passageway through maybe some sort of like defensive wall surrounding the city or something. In ancient times, it was usually this large and kind of complex structure that was made up of an outer gate and an inner gate, and then there was space in between those two. So it was the space that was in between, and sometimes that was just a corridor with like recessed guard rooms, and sometimes it had more of a spacious courtyard. But it's that area that the Bible, when it says something happened in the gates. Now, the open spaces around these gate complexes, they were, imagine them like filled, bustling activity. The town's elders would oversee legal proceedings in that area. The townspeople came and went. They bought and sold goods. They would maybe catch up on the news of the day, that kind of a thing. So these gate complexes, they were kind of like the central place for building people's social identity, for shaping how that they interacted with their neighbors and how they governed themselves, how they went to war, and, kind of how they perceived themselves. So when we read about this description of Abraham at the city gates, making this land purchase for the burial place of Sarah, maybe you have the same question that I had. Why is there so much detail here, right? And if we look at this from the ancient Near East perspective, we'll see something about ancient land transfer customs, and that's going to help us to understand why is there so much detail here. Okay, but before I get into that, I just want to interject something that I think is kind of fascinating about this cave that Abraham buys, the cave of Machpelah. So after the Western Wall in Jerusalem, this cave at Machpelah has remained the most sacred monument of the Jewish people. So Sarah, Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, Leah, they're all buried there. And Jewish tradition tells us that Adam and Eve were actually buried in this cave because it was the entrance to the Garden of Eden. Now, that's tradition, right? And so there's a midrash where Abraham kind of discovered that one day when he just kind of happened upon the cave. It says that I think it says that he smelled like the garden, and he knew what it was. So in the midrash, Abraham believes on the promises of resurrection, and so because of that, he wanted Sarah to be buried in the same place as Adam and Eve would have been, so she would arise in the land with Adam and Eve. And then tradition says that we talked in an earlier lesson about Abraham and Sarah's hospitality. So the tradition says that Abraham and Sarah used their hospitality to help mankind like return to that original relationship with God as it had been in the garden before sin entered. So because that was like their focus, that was why they, if you ever want to know why were they hospitable, that was it, to give them a taste of the garden. So naturally it would be important for Abraham that this cave be like a perpetual reminder to his descendants of the spiritual goal to return to Eden. So that's kind of cool. So that might shed some light at least on what the ancients believed about this particular spot, this particular cave, and the importance of it. Okay, so now let's talk about why it was important for Abraham to buy the land and not just have use of the cave, because that was an option. He could have just used the cave. All right. So it actually turns out, we're camping out in Genesis 23. And it turns out that this whole Genesis 23 is a detailed description of the formal legal negotiation for the purchase of land. All right. Now, in case you want to study up on this more, because it's really an interesting topic, I got this information from Gene Tucker, and and he has an article in the Journal of Biblical Literature called The Legal Background of Genesis 23 from the Journal of Biblical Literature. Okay, so, Abraham, he remained a temporary resident or an alien, a stranger, right? Moving from place to place with his flocks at this point. His descendants were promised land by God, but Abraham was told that he would not see that fulfillment in his lifetime, right? So again, we talked about this before. Everything Abraham did was an eye toward God's promises for his future descendants. So what he's wanting to do is he's wanting to root those future descendants into the land with this land purchase. All right. So let's dig into Genesis 23. Starting at verse 4, then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, I am a foreigner and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site so I can bury my dead. All right. Now, for any business transaction, for any legal transaction within the city, it was necessary for Abraham to conform to the laws of the city. Okay, so what we see there, those verses I just read, he's appealing to the community leaders, sell me some property. All right. Now, ancient Near East land customs being what they were, Abraham needed to do some specific things to secure this land for his future generations. Okay. And truthfully, he had a lot of things that were not going in his favor. So for one, he was a stranger in this land. And although the land was promised to him by God, the current residents would only honor a land transfer that was legally binding according to their customs. Okay? Because they didn't honor what God had said. So a foreigner like Abraham, he couldn't normally own land. All right, he would need special community permission in order for the land transfer to be binding for the future. And again, everything what we're looking at here is how are we going to make this binding for the future? Okay. So the other thing that wasn't in Abraham's favor was this cultural idea. It was like a deep-seated emotional attachment to the land. So much so that it rarely changed hands. Okay, remember, one's identity is entwined in the land that they're tied to, the land that sustains them. So land was normally held on to for immediate family, then the extended clan and descendants. All right, so it was not a cultural norm to transfer ancestral land to a foreigner, because that foreigner and his descendants then might sort of upset the local demographic balance and like somehow maybe impair the local tribal cohesion, which was important. So because of these cultural aspects, Abraham's first step was to get permission to purchase the land. So then we read on, the Hittites replied to Abraham, Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. Neither of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead. Okay? Now, in Hebrew, this reads a prince of Elohim, Nasi Elohim, which was a phrase showing the highest honor and respect. So we see here that Abraham had a very positive, very high reputation, according to the citizens, and that probably worked in his favor. So what we see is Abraham was loyal to God, and in turn, his loyalty to God, Abraham was known as a righteous and just person. He was known for his hospitality. That then would have given him favor in the eyes of the people, right? So when we're loyal to God, that can cause us to have favor in the eyes of the people. So that may be something, a dynamic we can look for in our own lives. God can give us divine favor in other people's eyes. So like God's kids can get perks that way, right? So reading on, verse 7, then Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land, the Hittites. And he said to them, if you are willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron and Zohar on my behalf. So he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you. Okay? Now, that phrase, people of the land, that could either mean like the general body of citizens, or it might have been like a specific social entity that was in charge of like performing some judicial and political functions. We might think of it like a town council. So the phrase full price, that means nothing owing. And there's some other ancient Near East texts that use that wording in final contracts of sale, and that would show that the sale was irrevocable. So again, Abraham wanted to ensure that the burial place is final and irrevocable, can't be contested by anyone later. Okay. So next we read, Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people and replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of his city. No, my lord, he said, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that's in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead. Again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in their hearing, listen to me, if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there. Okay? So it's translated give in those verses, but there doesn't really seem to be any indication that it was offered as a gift. It may have been they were trying to offer it as a gift, but nevertheless, it needed to be an actual land purchase with money exchanged in order for it to be binding. Okay, so it may be that the townspeople were trying to say, "I'm going to give it to you as a gift." Maybe that was the little hint in the wording, but Abraham needed to purchase it in order for it to be binding. Okay, then we move on. Again, Abraham bowed down before the people and said, listen to me, I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there. And Ephron answered Abraham, listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver, but what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Okay. Now, what we're seeing here, only a land payment that's willingly offered by the seller will ensure that this transaction doesn't get challenged. Okay, so that's why it was had to be Ephron and not Abraham to state the price of the land. And then once why there was a price that was stated, there's no further bargaining. All right. Now, have you noticed that there was a repeated use of the phrase, listen to me? I kind of emphasized that when I was reading it. Well, apparently that phrase is some kind of a legal language for land purchase contracts, which is interesting. So moving on, Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. So Ephron's field of Machpelah near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the borders of the field, was deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. And afterwards, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. Okay? So again, the city gate served as a civic center. The transactions were done at the gate. One of the reasons being that doing it there gave the widest possible publicity in order to avoid possible litigation later. So what that means is in the gates of the city, that's where everybody is. There's witnesses that see this happening. So these verses read like a legal document. We've got the identity of the transferor. We have the location of the property. We have the description of the contents, the identity of the transferee. We have the mode of acquisition of property rights. And then we have the fact that the conveyance of the title was done in the presence of witnesses in a public setting. Okay? So Abraham bought the field with the cave as an expression of faith in God's promises. You know, again, Genesis 15:18, God makes that covenant with Abraham. Unto your seed I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. And that includes where this burial cave is. So God tells Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved in a strange land for 400 years. And then only after the fourth generation would his descendants return to the land, right? And they would settle it. So purchasing the land and the cave legally, what Abraham's doing is he's giving his descendants proof that they have roots in the land. And that's going to be important. Because without this proof, you know, his descendants would come back into the land and the land would be occupied by people that were saying, you don't have any connection or any rights to it. Does that sound familiar for today? So Abraham understood the importance of his descendants knowing that that's theirs. Okay? The burial cave and the field, that would provide a draw for his descendants to come home to. Right? That's what it means to give them roots in the land. And, you know, Jacob and Joseph, they knew the significance of the burial place to the Hebrew people. And that's why in Genesis 47, Jacob insists, remember, he insists that he would be buried in that same place. And Jacob made Joseph swear that he would bring his body back from Egypt to be buried in Hebron, in this place. Jacob wanted to make sure that those in the future generations after Abraham would still recognize God's promises to them. And when you think about it, think about how important that is, right? It's important that we still recognize God's promises to us. So later, you know, Moses sends spies to the land, right? And it's written that they come to Hebron. So those spies would have seen the graves of the patriarchs and the matriarchs with their very own eyes, right? And the lesson there would be that they're not actually going in to conquer a foreign country that's like owned by the Canaanites, but instead they're going back. They're coming home. They're coming to reclaim their home. And so the spies would have seen this visible reminder that Abraham, that was given to them, right? And that might shed a little bit of light on just what a grave sin it was for the 10 spies to come back with an evil report and to say, like, we don't want to do this. The spies were, in a great sense, rejecting their ancestral home and rejecting God's promises. You know, they ended up that they had more respect for the giants of the land than they did for the giants of the faith, those patriarchs and matriarchs who trusted that God would indeed make good on this promise that he's given to Abraham. So I hope that you find it comforting like I do, that God made sure to show the legality of his land promises. You know, we today live in a time where there's a great many fulfilled promises of Scripture, but there's still more to come, right? So may we all, remain faithful that all of those promises will come to fruition, whether it's in our lifetime, our children's lifetime, future descendants. And for me, it's stories like this, how God uses the culture of the day, how he uses he works through the legality of the culture. It's things like that that helps me to know that God is, really intimately interested in being the God throughout all of our generations. So I hope that brings you comfort as well. That's it for this week's lesson, and I'll see you next week. And until then, be blessed.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.